Mr. Ryvchin, you were born in Ukraine, is that right?
I was.
And then migrated to Australia as a refugee when you were 4 years old.
Correct, yeah.
Can you explain why that came about?
My family had lived in the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before that for generations, and the condition of the Jews in that part of the world was hideous. We were subjected to state anti-Semitism, which manifested in the form of anti-Semitic laws, which kept the Jews out of certain professions, regulated where we could and couldn't live. It then cascaded through the institutions, through academia, where Jews were subjected to entry quotas in universities. We were banned from certain professions entirely. And because it was so prevalent in the institutions and sanctioned by government, it then became public, it became common, it became part of the national fabric to view the Jews as being lesser human beings. And I think we've seen elements of that in this country in the last few years, where it's gone from the institutions to the mainstream. And speaking to my parents and grandparents and very many members of the Soviet Jewish community growing up and through my adult life, the thing that terrified them the most, it wasn't even the fear of the pogrom, it wasn't even the collaboration with the Nazis in World War II. It was the daily ridicule, the humiliation, the street abuse that they faced in the shop queue, on the trolley bus, in the schoolyard. The Jewish people had their lives and value wholly debased. And when that occurs, you see rampant violence when the opportunity presents itself, and you see a complete dehumanization of people. And so from my family's perspective, when the opportunity arose to leave, they seized it despite leaving penniless with meager possessions, not knowing where they were going, but they wanted to go anywhere but there to give my brother and me some opportunity of equality and freedom in this country.
And can you tell us a little bit about how they went up establishing their life in Australia?
It was a classic migrant experience. You know, my grandmother was a doctor in the Soviet Union, my grandfather was an engineer, my parents were teachers, and they came here and they had to start again. My mother worked in a pie shop, my father cleaned toilets in a synagogue and drove a cab and sold rags out of the boot of his car at Flemington markets. They made do like all migrants do. And it was obviously very difficult, but they never complained because they knew that they had given me freedom and a chance to go beyond the squalor of Jewish existence in the Soviet Union, to be judged on merits and achievement and character rather than nationality. And we faced very little anti-Semitism in our existence here. There was one incident that always stayed with me when a neighbour in the apartment above us that we had purchased in Randwick, upon learning that we were Jewish, he would stand on his balcony night after night and bellow at us and thunder, Hitler didn't finish the job, I will finish it for him. And that was an isolated incident. That doesn't mark my experience as a Jew in this country prior to October 7. But seeing the terror return to my parents' eyes in that moment, it showed me that no matter how far they sought to flee from the Soviet Union, that experience would always be with them. Anti-Semitism is something that will pursue the Jewish people no matter where we go.
And in your role as co-CEO of ECAJ, can you just tell us a little bit about what that involves and your interactions with members of the Jewish community?
Primarily, it involves advocating for the Jewish people on all issues that concern and affect them, which particularly since October 7 has been soaring anti-Semitism, exclusion from cultural institutions, again, the street abuse, the violence directed towards them, the lapse of security. I've dealt with hundreds of members of my community. I've counseled them through some of the most difficult times they've experienced. I've spoken to members of the LGBT community who were forced out of the Mardi Gras and prevented from marching. And I then offered to march with them in solidarity, which was an extremely uplifting experience for me and a validating experience. I've spoken to students who fear more than anything being identified with their school uniform because they would then have to answer the question of which school they belong to and reveal their Jewishness. I've spoken to small business owners who have lost everything, single mothers who have been harangued and abused and threatened online to such an extent that their lives effectively paused, they had to suspend their business. It's been a privilege to serve the community. It's been the highest honor to advocate for them in this time. But there are things happening in this country that should never have happened. And as I said, my family fled the Soviet Union to be as far physically as possible from that. But the things that we've seen in this country replicate what happened there. The rampant street abuse, the violence, the denigration, and the sheer relish with which it's inflicted on the Jewish people so often. I think there are clear parallels.
So while acknowledging the broad range of experience of the Jewish community of anti-Semitism, you yourself in your statement also set out what you've experienced by way of anti-Semitism, and that's included a large number of threats, including death threats. Is that right?
It is. Look, it's not something that I typically dwell on. I view my role and my function as advocating for others. I don't like to dwell on my own condition, but it's a part of my job and it's a part of my life. You know, we've had to appoint a security agency that reviews all the online content and the threats, because if I did that myself, it would consume my life and I'd have time for nothing else. I'm happy to tender those reports to this commission. They make for painful reading, week after week, streams of pages with abuse directed at myself. Not merely abuse. I mean, abuse is like water off a duck's back at this point. We're talking about death threats, threats against my children, my wife, people seeking out my address, threatening my home, fixated individuals. I've dealt with dozens of individuals who day after day post about me in a personal way, who trawl through family photos and repost photos of my children. I've been abused on the street, and again, that was a moment that really harkened back to the Soviet Union. To be called a Jewish dog on the streets of Sydney, it shocked me. I stood there hearing these words, and it stopped me in my tracks. And it made me realize the low point to which we've fallen as a society. The fact that to be a Jew, to represent mainstream Jewish positions in public, comes with such inherent risk, and security has then been a part of my life. And that's obviously curtailed my freedoms. It's impacted on my wife and my children, our ability to live spontaneously, to walk down the street, to walk our dog, to go to the shops without having to plan beforehand and ensure that security is in place. It angers me. It angers me that this great country, which my grandparents cherished and took immense pride in, that it has fallen to such a point. And so much of what they experienced, we're now experiencing here.
Can you take me back to the morning of 17 January 2025 when there was an attack on your former home? Take me back to that morning when you found out about it.
So we'd returned the day before from a holiday, family holiday in Brisbane, which I spent mainly doing media, as it turned out, because the day that we departed for Brisbane, there was the attempted arson attack on Newtown Synagogue, and a few days later there was a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. So I was doing a lot of media and doing a lot of work during that time. The day after we arrived back, I was scheduled to fly to Poland at 6 a.m. that morning for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. So I was looking forward to that one day to actually recover a little bit and sort out my affairs ahead of that trip. And just before 6 a.m. my wife shook me awake and showed me her phone, and there was a video there of cars daubed with graffiti. I could see F the Jews on the back window. I could see smouldering smoke and embers and two firemen in full gear circling the car. And it didn't immediately strike me what it was or what that site was, even though it'd been our family home for 5 years and we really cherished and loved that place. But it was when I actually saw, oddly, a plant in the nature strip out in front. It was a yucca plant, which when we moved into the house, we found it shriveled and dying in the garage, and my children and I replanted it and watered it daily. We even named it. And then to see that plant, the scene of an arson attack, it really brought home what had happened, the fact that we'd been targeted. And we were immediately concerned for our children, our 3 daughters. The phone was ringing non-stop. Police,
very overwhelming to
counter-terrorism,
think about.
ASIO, the Prime Minister, the Premier, journalists all looking for us to confirm that it was indeed our former home that had been targeted. We sent our children away to my mother-in-law's. We didn't want them to be exposed to this. We didn't want them to overhear the conversations. And we didn't want them to be present when counter-terrorism came to our house to give us advice. And again, that made me very sad. We then went to the house and I inspected the damage, and I saw the red paint on the front wall signifying blood. I spoke to the neighbours in the adjoining property who lived there for 50 years, and I went into their home and they embraced me and they were fearful for my safety and I was fearful for theirs. And there was something of a house of mourning in their home. They were cycling through the emotions of grief, of shock, of anger. They couldn't believe what our city had become, that this could happen. And it really struck me again in a very personal way, because that home to me, aside from being our home where we completed our family, where we brought our youngest daughter home from the hospital, it also symbolized something very profound for me. When we moved here from the Soviet Union, my grandfather was unable to find work due to lack of English skills and ill health, and he volunteered driving a bus for the Burgess Center, which is a Jewish community center that provides social services for the elderly. And he would pick me up from school in that bus, and we would drive up and down that road, Military Road. It's a beautiful road with views of the harbour on one side and the Pacific Ocean on the other, and we would drop off and pick up the elderly people in the bus, and my grandfather would gaze upon that road. To him it symbolized freedom and opportunity. And I realized that when that had happened, this was a strike not merely on us and me and my family, this was a strike on the Jewish community. This was a strike on our way of life. And I could see the despair in our neighbors, in the broader community, because it constituted an escalation as well. There had been previous firebombings, vehicles, synagogues, but this was the first time a private home had been targeted, an individual had been targeted. And the police documents, the court documents revealed that the mastermind actually instructed the assailants in the use of Molotov cocktails, in the use of handguns, and it could have been far worse. There was an inferno to the power lines above. The front room of that house is where my two daughters shared a room. So had a Molotov cocktail been used, it could have been a great tragedy. But I realized in that moment that we were on a path to a catastrophe. And it seemed to me that at that point we had passed the point at which it could be stopped. We were in a slipstream. And I addressed the media and I said that there's an evil at work in this country, and that sooner or later we're going to wake up and someone's going to be dead. And this was January, and by December, on that same road, 3 kilometers down, I know it's 3 kilometers because I used to jog it frequently to Bondi Beach, on that same road there was a horrific massacre which has transformed us permanently.
How did you explain this attack to your children?
It was very difficult. We tried to protect them from it as much as possible, but I don't believe in deceiving my children, even though perhaps I should at times, and perhaps that was one of those times. As I said, the next morning I was bound for Poland at 6 a.m. and I left my wife to answer the questions from particularly our middle daughter, who was asking, are they still looking for our home? Why did they do this? Are we still in danger? And I still don't know how to answer those questions. I shield them from the fixated individuals, from the police action that's been initiated. They don't know about this, they will now. But it saddens me that they see this as now normal. They see this as the price of being a Jew and speaking proudly and publicly for your community in this country, that this is what it entails and this is what it comes with.
You go on to talk in your statement about learning about the Dural caravan incident. Can you tell us what sort of impact that had on you and the Jewish community?
So I'd spent 2 to 3 weeks in Poland, in Auschwitz, but also touring other Holocaust sites and learning. And as I began the flight back home, I switched on my phone, switched on the Wi-Fi a few hours into the flight just to check in with family and colleagues, which was a mistake. And news at that point in time was breaking of Dural. Now, it turned out, months later that it was a hoax and it wasn't a viable explosive, but at that point in time, it was believed that it was packed with explosives that were destined for the Jewish community. There were reports that a list of Jewish targets was enclosed within that caravan. And this occurs just several weeks after we were targeted in what they believed was our home. And my wife is texting me furiously and saying, this was about 10:30 p.m. in Sydney at the time, and she's asking, do I wake the girls and get the hell out of the house? And again, it was one of those rare times when I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't know whether it was hysterical to do so or whether we were in mortal danger at that moment. And again, my feelings are merely an exemplar of what the whole Jewish community was feeling. There was a state of sheer terror in the community. At that point in time, anything could have happened. And this is what we've had to live with and contend with for a long period of time now.
You've talked about how incidents like these and the accumulation of incidents over time also affect the way Jewish people move throughout the world and it affects their behaviour. Can you tell us about any observations that you've made on that issue?
Yeah, look, I see this in my community. I see this in students at Mariah College who, when contemplating their move to university the following year, I asked them point blank, because I could sense their tension and their anxiety about going to university. I asked them to what extent anti-Semitism factors in their choices for higher education. And every one of them, bar none, spoke about that it's a cardinal factor determining which course of study, which university is going to be more hospitable to them and accommodating of them as Jewish people. It's a scandal that needs to be the case. Every measure of security that we have, whether it be the constant police presence outside schools and synagogues, whether it be the experience of walking to and from synagogue and our homes, under helicopters overhead and police all around and cement barriers to prevent vehicular rammings, that affects people's psyche, that affects their quality of life, their sense of self, their ability to interact with the society and world around them. And so there's an immense cost, not only financially, but in terms of the psychological trauma, the change that occurs in people from having to live year after year in this state. And obviously post-Bondi, that's only been escalated further. And I think we'll see the impact of that in terms of the psychology of the community for a long time to come. The Jewish people have always carried with them an awareness that a golden age ends, and normally it doesn't end calmly, it's shattered. There's a sense that no matter how good we have it in a place at a point in time, we may always have to take flight and leave. And I've had families calling me and saying, completely calmly, saying, will you tell me when the time to go is? And I told them I would. I told them that I will counsel them and advise them. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going down with the ship if that's what is required. I love this country, and I will continue to fight for the future of this country and the future of my community in this country. But I completely understand those who are thinking about exit strategies and plan Bs. That's what's necessary. History has shown how quickly things can change, what can come from the mob. And the Jewish community in this country has been confronted by multiple mobs that have incited against us, that have shattered our sense of peace and calm and belonging in this country. And this is where we are now.
And then we come to the terrible events at Bondi, and you were particularly close to Rabbi Eli Schlanger, is that right?
Yeah.
And you knew several of the other victims and other people caught up in that event, is that right?
Yes.
And so on top of everything else that was leading up to that point, for that event to then occur, what sort of impact does that have?
Look, it broke my heart. It broke my heart. That community, the Chabad of Bondi community, I've been a part of my entire life. This is a community made up of Soviet migrants like myself, and we came to this country in very feeble, depleted circumstances. We were in a way almost pariahs within the Jewish community itself because we couldn't speak Hebrew. We were very much Soviet people, whether we like to admit it or not. The men typically weren't circumcised because that was a prohibited practice in the Soviet Union. And so we banded together and we formed a beautiful community where we supported each other, we nurtured each other. And people like Tibor Weitzen, people like Alex Clayton, people like Reuven Morrison, I've known my whole life. They've known me since I was a small child that migrated to this country. And they were tremendous human beings. They were kind, they were compassionate, they were wise, they were family people, they were patriots that adored this country. And their loss has left us bereft. And Rabbi Eli Schlanger, that's a loss that's hit me most of all. He was one of the dearest people in my life. He was my rabbi, and I realize now that I took him for granted because I thought that he would always be there. I thought that this is the guy, day or night, you call him for anything and he picks up. No one picks up these days. He would always pick up. He would never let anybody down. And it's really heartbreaking. But again, I don't want to monopolize the loss because there are hundreds of people in the Jewish community that would call him their best friend like I would. That's what he meant to people. And my loss and our loss is minuscule compared to Rabbi Ullman, his father-in-law, his wife and his 5 children, his sisters. It's a profound loss. And it's something that can't be replaced. You don't get people like Eli Schlanger. He was a phenomenal human being. and he was the beating heart of our little community. And so we have to move on, and we have to try to replace what he offered us collectively, because there's no one person that will ever replace what he did.
You've also talked about what you've observed to be the normalisation of anti-Semitism, sort of moving from the shadows into the mainstream. What are some examples of that? How have you observed that manifesting in that way?
When you had the outbreak of violence in Israel on October 7, you immediately saw an eruption of, again, that familiar feeling of relish, of ascendancy. People enjoyed what they saw. The Jewish community was ripped to pieces by it. We felt a personal sense of peril and responsibility when we looked upon Jewish women being dragged by their hair to captivity, people decapitated, people's limbs being held aloft like trophies. This broke us, and yet there were people on the streets of Sydney and Lakemba cheering this as a day of pride and a day of joy. And that sparked that sense of entitlement, that ability to seize the opportunity to look upon Hamas as the example of what can be done to the Jews, how they can be brought low, humiliated, plundered and slaughtered. And the people among us, and sadly there are people among us who crave that, who want to see that, October 7 was the highest point of their lives. And so that's why you had immediately groups like the Palestine Action Group calling protests to celebrate what they called the humiliation of Israel. You have the deplorable scenes at the Opera House, again, the sheer joy and enjoyment displayed by those people, and entirely without consequence. And when you have behavior that attracts no consequence, it becomes normalized. And when you deal with extremists motivated by hatred, there's no sense that that extremism and those activities will naturally reach the end of their course, they'll blow off a little steam. That's not how they operate. They go exactly as far as they're permitted to go. And that's why very shortly after those incidents at the Opera House and Lakemba, you saw more incidents. You saw incidents such as at Camp Cove in Watson's Bay, a man standing up on the beach and shouting for the Jews to get off the beach. That man did not become an anti-Semite on October 7. He obviously harbored those views a long time, but it gave him the permission, and the lack of response to the actions on October 8 and 9 made him feel entitled to act like a brute. When that man was confronted, he threatened to rape the wife of the man who confronted him. You had incidents like at Office Works in Melbourne, where a man sought to have a page of the Jewish News laminated and was denied service. You had a school in Sydney seeking to hire carnival equipment, jumping castles and the like, and the small business owner replied and said that they would not hire equipment to Zionists. And again, in every case, this was not done in secret. This was done with pride, openly. They thought they were acting righteously. And when you have for 2.5 years the incitement against the Jewish community, the characterization of ordinary Jewish Australians as child killers, as supporters of genocide, of course people will act against us and think they're doing something noble and righteous. So that's where you have this progression from behavior which is normal to behavior which is actually viewed as noble.
You've also talked about some of the conspiracy theories pervading about Jewish people, including the theory that the Adass synagogue firebombing was somehow orchestrated by Jewish people. What do those sorts of conspiracy theories tell you about the extent to which anti-Semitism has become entrenched and developed over time?
I mean, it shows the durability of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and obviously I've written about the subject, and you see over thousands of years the characterization of the Jew as being malevolent and deceptive and bloodthirsty and all-powerful and all-controlling. It has never changed, and that's what makes it so potent. It's that exactly that consistency. And of course, seeing our synagogues burned, seeing our homes attacked, for the good and decent in this country, which is the overwhelming majority of Australians, they're appalled and shocked by it. But for those who are fixed in their hatred of the Jewish people, they can't bring themselves to accept that this has happened, and that perhaps in some way they're even responsible for it. So their response is to deny. And we've seen this with the Holocaust. It stems from that sort of pathology as well, where you have millions of individual crimes of slaughter and plunder and torture, and yet people can deny the Holocaust. So of course, if they can deny the Holocaust, they will deny the Israel synagogue burning. They will claim that Bondi itself was a false flag, a Mossad operation. And what we've seen is that this is not confined to the dark recesses of society, the irrational, the paranoid. You see eminent Australians in certain cases, including cardiologists, talking about ASIO being infiltrated by the Zionist lobby. These are educated people who hold these views. And it shows the severity of anti-Semitism. And it shows, again, its normalization, because those words were uttered in plain sight at a public forum. You have a Greens member of parliament talking about Jewish tentacles wrapped around power and influence in this country. These conspiracy theories abound us now. They've been normalized. And so inevitably you're going to have people who view the Jews as being a unique threat and menace, which warrants any act against us, up to and including our slaughter.
You conclude your statement with some comments about the way forward. Would you like to speak to that topic now?
I still firmly believe in the greatness of this country and the fundamental goodness of Australians. It's something that I've experienced my whole life, notwithstanding what's occurred in the past 2.5 years. And I still believe paramount that you have to have education to drive out the ignorance, and you have to have engagement, because when you have engagement between Jews and non-Jews, the mythology that ensnares us is pushed to the side. People see the Jews for who they are, and they're less willing to believe the nonsense that is said about us. And when you have people talking for the denial, advocating for the denial of cultural safety to the Jewish people, trying to purge public institutions and cultural space of Jews, the reason for doing so is to prevent us from showing the world who we are. We're numerically minuscule. Most Australians will never interact with Jewish people, but it's through our contributions to this country, to the science, to the wealth, to the culture of this place, that we show our humanity, which is precisely why people seek to prevent us from doing so. I also believe, as I've said, in consequences. That is the only way we will restore this country to what it once was, which was a fair place. There have to be consequences, social, political, legal consequences. The criminal justice system has to play its part. But ultimately, I still believe that things can be brought back to somewhere of what they were, or perhaps we can get to somewhere better. But I'm concerned. I'm concerned for the future of this country, for the safety of my own children. And this is the state we find ourselves in. I think it's tragic.